Attila talks taxes. He has been for over 45 years, and there isn't a human on the planet with more experience solving problems on behalf of taxpayers. He wants to solve your problem, whether you know you have one or not. So if you do have a tax problem, call our office or visit the website TaxHelpOnline.com. Or if you don't have a tax problem, your current tax problem is taxes themselves. So let's get into the policy issues of today. And there's a lot of things to talk about today. Well, first of all, Forbes says there's a DOGE dividend being talked about, with the savings being found with all the waste, fraud, and duplication that they are able to root out. What's that going to look like?
First of all, to call it a DOGE dividend is remarkable, because you're right, they have ferreted out tens of billions of dollars so far in waste, fraud, and duplication. And one has to wonder, Joshua, how much savings we're going to find just from the people in the Social Security system that are dead and still drawing Social Security benefits. There are thousands, in fact, millions of these people that are in excess of 100 years of age that are supposedly continuing to draw Social Security benefits. So the Social Security Administration, now the DOGE rather, has announced that they're going to be digging into Social Security Administration records to find out exactly who's getting this money, where it's going, and how that fraud is being committed. But there's no question about the fact that you can't have people that are 150 years of age drawing Social Security benefits. And there's people on the list that are older than the country, supposedly, that are drawing Social Security benefits. If that's true, then obviously that's got to stop. And the people that allowed that to go on have to be held accountable. But the DOGE benefits specifically, they're talking about $5,000 per married filing jointly tax return in terms of a tax credit or a refund, and $2,500 for each individual tax return that's filed. And it's the right thing to do, Josh. These excess payments should be given back to the taxpayers that paid them in. There's
taxpayer money.
No question about that.
It's taxpayer money in the first place. Give us back our money. If they're wasting the money, it's one thing if it's going to constitutionally ordained government activities. That's one thing. Waste, fraud, duplication, give me my damn money back.
And a perfect example of how diabolical it is for governments to keep these payments. In the state of Minnesota, 2 years ago, we had a budget surplus in the state of Minnesota of over $18 billion. Right? This was over and above the appropriated funds that the state of Minnesota needed to function. Rather than giving that money back to taxpayers, Walz administration, the would-be vice president in the sputtered Kamala Harris presidential campaign, the Walz administration in Minnesota squandered every dime of that money. All right, and it's one thing to take taxpayers' money and use it for legitimate government purposes, like you said. That's a constitutionally ordained use of the money, and that's fine. But it's quite another thing to use that money to just squander it, and that's what they did. And they didn't use it for bridges and roads and buildings and dams and power plants, like you would think that government agencies might do. They're not responsible for power plants, but the point is, they didn't use it for capital investment that would benefit current taxpayers and future taxpayers. They didn't use it for capital investment that would benefit production and industry in the state of Minnesota. They created more welfare programs. So not only did they squander the $18 billion they had in hand, but they created programs that need to be funded in the future with even more taxpayer dollars. So it's a domino effect in terms of getting into the pockets of the citizens of this state. So when there is
we really dodged a bullet in terms of what the current administration is doing and what the would-be administration would have been doing with the money that they, and the perfect example of that is what's going on with the IRS, because the IRS is about to lay off 67,000 employees.
Well, not 1,000, 6,700.
6,700 employees? Oh,
yes,
okay. 67,000 would be their entire workforce, which we'll get there. We'll get there.
If we keep doing the right thing, we'll get there. But
that's 10.
Exactly
that's still
right.
that's 10% of the workforce. That's a lot. That's a solid chunk.
It's a big deal. And as a matter of fact, Josh, those 6,700 employees, they're all probationary workers that have been hired by the IRS in the last year or year and a half. Remember that the Biden administration with Vice President Kamala Harris was they were entirely responsible for the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. That is the act that provided $80 billion in supplemental funding to the IRS to allow the agency to hire 87,000 more employees over the course of 10 years. So these 10,000 workers that we're talking about here, these probationary workers, were hired under that act, and now they're being turned right back out the door.
Which, by the way, the Inflation Reduction Act, which didn't reduce anything. Their idea of reducing inflation was to hire a bunch of people to the IRS
And
to
more
take money
Yeah.
out of the marketplace so that there's less money in the marketplace. That's how they're going to reduce inflation. That's not.
Yeah,
That's
well, you know, the title is absurd. The whole premise of the bill was absurd. There's no question about it. It would have nothing. I actually wrote an article that was published on National Review, so you can go to nationalreview.com, put my name, Dan Pilla, in the search box, or Daniel Pilla in the search box, and you'll come up with my articles. There's several dozen articles that are archived there on National Review, and I did talk about the 87,000 workers quite at length in a number of different articles that were published by National Review, and I was against that from day one, no question about that, because about 70% of all of that Inflation Reduction Act money was pointed at IRS enforcement. There was almost no money that was pointed at taxpayer outreach, education, or assistance, which is what people really need when they're dealing with the IRS. They need help. They need to understand what the law requires. They need to know what they're supposed to do. And we've got a tax code that consists of 4 million words that have been changed more than 6,000 times since 2001. And so people don't understand what their responsibilities are. So I was set dead against that appropriation from day one. I wrote about it extensively. And now we're seeing that appropriation of 80 billion. It was reduced to 60 billion a year ago. Now it's going to be clawed back even further, let's hope, by the Trump administration, with the idea that the IRS's assistance functions, their taxpayer education and outreach functions, need to be beefed up, not their enforcement functions.
Well, I've got a couple of ideas that I want to talk about based on that. But before I even do, I just want to highlight again the point of what this administration is doing with your money compared to what the last administration and what would have been a continuation of the last administration wanted to do with your money. It's just a night and day difference. So,
it couldn't be a more stark difference. And in fact, I made a comment during the election cycle, not the election itself, but the election cycle, that in my lifetime, I'm 67 years of age right now. In my lifetime, I never saw a more glaring example of the differences between two candidates than we saw with Trump and Harris.
Right.
And if Harris had been elected, there is no question in my mind that not $1 of waste, fraud, or duplication.
oh, especially not fraud. They wouldn't have found $1 of fraud, not 1 cent of fraud. None of it would have been fraud.
Not a dollar.
None of it would have been fraud.
What's going on with the Social Security Administration would have continued to go on. What was going on at the border would have continued to go on, and American taxpayers would be squeezed even more as a result of it. And if you want proof of that, all you got to do is look at what was going on in Minnesota under the Walz administration. $18 billion squandered. All these illegal alien criminals, the criminals, are finding sanctuary in this state, and it's
and then taxpayers on the hook for even more on top of it. But yeah, it's just essentially watching one administration want to audit you and everybody you love and your grandma who's already dead, and the current administration who is actually trying to audit the government and figure out why they're giving money to your grandma who is already dead for some reason.
The point you make highlights the absurdity of the left in reaction to the DOGE audits of these various government agencies. The left was completely determined, Josh, to fund the Internal Revenue Service to the tune of $80 billion more dollars. Now remember, that was supplemental appropriation. That was over and above the IRS's normal appropriation of roughly $12.5 billion a year. So $80 billion over 10 years is another $8 billion over the 12. So they wanted to nearly double the IRS's annual appropriation, right, to about $20 billion, and hire 87,000 more IRS workers. And about 70% of that workforce was going to be dedicated to enforcement, specifically audits and collection. So the left had no qualms whatsoever about turning the dogs loose on the American public, businesses in particular, medium to high income taxpayers that produce. They wanted to audit the snot out of them. They wanted to grind that segment of the population into powder, but had no intent whatsoever to ferret out as much as $1 of fraud in the federal government. Whereas this administration is focusing on ferreting out the fraud, the duplication, and the waste that's going on in federal government. They want to audit these dozens and dozens of government agencies to see where this waste and fraud and duplication is, and the left is going crazy. They want no part of it. How dare anybody audit them? They want to use government resources to audit you.
The shoe's on the other foot, and it's nice to see. That loops right back around to a question that actually I have. Now, this administration is starting to claw back resources from the IRS, starting to lay off employees from the IRS, and even starting to use the IRS against the border, meaning they're not going to have resources freed up to go after individual citizens. Does that actually mean that attrition and layoffs have a real shot at shutting down the IRS in the next few years?
Well, it's going to take a while, Josh. First of all, there's right now at present, there's about 95,000 employees in the Internal Revenue Service. Now, the IRS has always had an attrition problem. That's nothing new. And this is why these 87,000 workers spread over 10 years, it was a little deceptive from some of the folks on the right screaming that there was going to be an IRS agent on every street corner looking at every business. That wasn't quite true. They were certainly going to focus on businesses and individuals and not government agencies. That's true. But there wasn't going to be an IRS person on every corner. No doubt about that.
Not every corner, but if you do the math, 80,000 divided by 50, that's a lot of agents per state, and that starts to get oppressive real quick. And you've said this over and over again that 87,000 was essentially trying to outpace attrition to a small degree. They have no shot at outpacing attrition. So what does that actually mean for the agency?
You're exactly right. There probably is no shot at outpacing attrition, and so the IRS is going to dwindle in terms of its workforce. There's no question about that. And that's going to be a challenge for Congress. Congress has to peel back some of the additional mission encroachment tasks that have been laid on the Internal Revenue Service. For example, the largest welfare program in the United States, Josh, is the Earned Income Tax Credit. All right, the Earned Income Tax Credit is a refundable credit to low-income taxpayers, and it's designed to give people more money back from the government than they paid in the first place, right? So it's a welfare program that's administered by the Internal Revenue Service. It is well recognized. The Government Accountability Office, the GAO, and the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration have done dozens of audits over the years and have pointed out that the Earned Income Tax Credit is the single largest source of fraud that's going on in the Internal Revenue Service, and that as many as 30% of the payments that go out from the IRS under the Earned Income Tax Credit are bogus payments. So you talk about an area of fraud, this is one of them. But they've known about this for 20 years, and they don't do anything to fix it. But yet the IRS is screwing itself into the ground to try to set up roadblocks and guardrails to keep Earned Income Tax Credit fraud at bay. Well, the government's got to they've got to repeal the Earned Income Tax Credit provisions of the tax code. They got to take them out of there and lower taxes to begin with so people don't have the burden in the first place. Right. That will shrink the responsibilities of the IRS, and it'll focus them more on their core job of collecting taxes.
Essentially, what it means for their capacity to go after non-filers is until they deal with some of the other, welfare state responsibilities that they've been saddled with, they're really just going to start to crumble under the weight of their own responsibilities.
Well, I've said for years that Congress is never going to come to its senses and do the right thing for the right reason. The right thing being the abolition of the Internal Revenue Code entirely and the abolition of the IRS and the adoption of some alternative system that makes more sense. I have maintained for years that the only way Congress is going to do that is if the IRS collapses of its own weight, if the system becomes unenforceable. And we are certainly reaching that point. So I'm in favor of that. There's no question about that. In the meantime, here's what the problem is. In the meantime, taxpayers still have to file tax returns. They still have to pay their taxes. We still have the IRS to deal with in terms of enforcement issues, wage levies and bank levies and so on. And guys like me that are in the position of helping people solve their tax collection problems sometimes get frustrated dealing with a non-responsive agency. So this is the friction that's going on. We want the IRS to go away, but if it goes away piecemeal, it just makes it that much more difficult for honest taxpayers to get the service they need. That's why I come back to the point that I've been making over and over and over again with this Inflation Reduction Act. The money needs to be spent on taxpayer assistance, outreach, and education, not on enforcement. Right. Here's the dirty little secret about IRS enforcement that people don't talk about. It's only 2% of federal revenue. We're talking about $5.5 trillion last year. Only 2% of federal revenue is collected through IRS enforcement action. 98% of every dollar paid to the IRS is paid voluntarily. And what I mean by voluntary is that it's paid into the IRS without the need of IRS intervention. All right. So where is your money better spent? Is it better spent on enforcement or is it better spent on education? People will do what they're supposed to do if they know what they're supposed to do and if the law is simple and easy to comply with. That's where the money's got to be spent.
Most of that 98% is paid in voluntarily because of that threat of, are you going to go to jail afterwards?
Oh, of course. It's not voluntary in the truest sense of the word,
Right.
where you can decide to comply or not comply. It's the Vito Corleone definition of voluntary, Josh.
Right.
The Vito Corleone definition of voluntary is they hold a gun to your head and they say either your brains or your signature will be on the contract. That's what they mean by, oh, okay, well, I guess I'll sign.
People are going to do what they're supposed to do. And if you take away the disease, you solve the symptom. And you were talking earlier about, the earned income credit being a huge, significant portion of the fraud in the federal government. And the reality is, as you said, you get rid of the taxes, then they have that money in their pocket in the first place. They don't need to go to the government to get that money back, meaning nobody who didn't have the money can't go get the money back. You solve the problem eliminating the bureaucracy, but they want their hands on the money.
There's no question about it, because the income tax does a number of things, but chief among them is it allows bureaucrats in Washington and, more specifically, it allows politicians in Congress, Senate, and the House of Representatives to control behavior, to pick winners and losers in the marketplace. And we see this with the tax code, and nowhere was this more evident than the Inflation Reduction Act, which loaded the tax code up with all kinds of credits and benefits for the production of electric vehicles and battery-powered energy sources.
Let's clarify that. That was the Inflation Reduction Act. So the Democrats that pushed that Inflation Reduction bill incentivized Elon's company to get more money.
Isn't that remarkable? Elon was the hero of the left as little as 2 years ago. Now he's the most evil guy on the planet. He was the hero as long as they were promoting the EVs, and he's the villain now that he wants to bring some efficiency and honesty to the federal government. Isn't it astonishing?
How fast the left eats their own. And I would also like to point out there's videos circulating of Obama talking about, and when he was running for president the first time, rooting out waste and inefficiency and fraud in the government and going after and shrinking. And you talked about Bill Clinton, who did the exact same thing. He actually did.
And Ronald Reagan did the exact same thing.
Reagan is a good example of a hated individual for leftists, but Democrats love Obama. They love Bill Clinton, and they did the exact, or at least Obama at least talked about it. He never did anything. He was the most talk the talk, but never actually do anything president that I've ever experienced in my lifetime.
You're exactly right about Obama, but Clinton did do something about it. Clinton did exactly the same thing in terms of reduction of forces at the federal level that Trump is doing right now. And there was about 100,000 federal employees that were riffed out of the federal government during Clinton's 2 terms in office. Most of this happened during his second term, but I'm telling you, he actually did this, and he did it using what could be considered the same word that Donald Trump is using now to accomplish the same thing. We've got to make the federal government leaner and meaner. We've got to respect the money of the American taxpayers that they work hard for and that they sacrifice to pay their taxes. And for every dollar of tax pay, that's one less dollar you have to take care of your family. And Clinton used terms like that to recognize the need of the federal government to be more efficient and to root out the waste, fraud, and duplication. And everybody was on board with it, and it was the greatest thing in the world. Now Trump does exactly the same thing with practically the same words, and he's the manifestation of evil. Well, it's really unbelievable.
I would like to say that history repeats itself, and it does rhyme, because Clinton used those exact same words, hijack tax reform, and do something completely different from what you were trying to push at the time. You had this momentum and you were pushing, and right now we see some momentum for tax reform. So we'll see. Does Trump use it to do real tax reform, or does Trump hijack it and do something different and just reinstitute the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which is good enough for now, but God knows it's going to be a 4-year time limit, and then they're going to use that again as a ticket for Vance to get back in the office.
Well, and we'll just have to see what happens. Trump is talking about some pretty substantial amendments to the tax code, and has even entertained the idea of abolishing the income tax. Nominee for Commissioner of Internal Revenue, who has not been ratified yet by the Senate.
I was just going to say, have they vetted him yet? I don't even think I've heard any information on that.
I've been nothing going on with the Commissioner of IRS. So the IRS is operating with an interim commissioner right now. So it remains to be seen. But the commissioner that has been nominated by Trump is in favor of adopting the fair tax, which which is a national retail sales tax. And in fact, a fair tax bill, you and I talked about this last time,
Right.
the fair tax bill has been introduced into Congress again. All right. Again, it's been introduced about 10 or 12 times over the last 20 or so years.
Now-
It was introduced once already this year, and it'll run through whatever course it runs through to see where it goes. But the
Right.
point is, the president's nominee for IRS commissioner is in favor of the fair tax. And maybe that's what Trump is thinking, is to get somebody in there on the inside that has the bigger picture of dismantling the IRS and the income tax code lock, stock, and barrel.
Yeah, I saw a comment on one of our conversations about this before that said, don't need any experience to dismantle the thing. So, I'm for it.
Here's what does have to happen, though, Josh. We need to keep this in perspective. You can turn the light switch off on the individual income tax. That's true. But you can't turn the light switch off on the IRS because of all of the administration that has to go through with the tax code that's currently in effect. You've got non-filers out there for prior years, got people that are delinquent for prior years. They can't just wipe the slate clean on that stuff. You've got tax returns that have been filed that are subject to audit right now. You can't just wipe the slate clean.
Let me pause you right there, because that does loop quite nicely back around to what I wanted to discuss, was this kind of totally hypothetical, for the purposes of the NSA tapes, situation for the situation where civil disobedience is the only option left, because at the point where the IRS can't enforce an income tax anymore, and there's no real information on how to deal with the income tax, and God forbid anyone who has delinquent taxes, they can't get a hold of the IRS. At that point, at what point do you just say, screw it, tax fraud? You know what I mean?
Well, yeah, I know exactly what you mean. The problem with that idea, and frankly, this was the theory that was driving the tax protester movement 35, 40 years ago. The IRS can't put everyone in jail, and if everybody, and even if 10 or 15% of the people in the country stop filing tax returns and stop paying taxes, there's nothing they could do about it, and the system would collapse, and there was that civil disobedience attitude. Well, you're right, and there was some truth to that, except here's what the problem is. Here's the disconnect. The IRS is far too automated now than it was then. And automated collection is in full swing now compared to what it was then. The IRS can automatically issue wage levies, bank levies, and tax liens that will intercept a person's paycheck and income stream, their bank account, their Social Security payments, assuming you're not 150 years old. It will intercept all of that stuff, and they don't have to go to court to get these orders to do that. So that's what's difficult.
What you're saying here is that because of technocracy, the way that the automation has been set up in the IRS, that they don't even actually have to know who you are and what you're doing to know that you're not paying your taxes and to start garnishing and taking your money from you.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Let me give you a simple scenario here. Let's say you got Jane and Joe American wage earner, right? They work for W-2 income. They decide, I'm not filing my tax returns anymore. They can hang me from the highest yardarm. I'm never paying another red cent of that Marxist income tax as long as I live. Let's just say they say that, right? So they stop filing their tax returns. Well, what happens is the IRS has got what they call an automated underreported program and an automated non-filer program. And what happens is the IRS compares every tax return by Social Security number with every information return, W-2, 1089, filed with the IRS by Social Security number. So this Jane and Joe American that are working for wages, that company's filing a W-2 with the Social Security Administration and the IRS. The IRS gets that data off the W-2, and using that Social Security number, they compare it with the tax returns that are filed. And they see, okay, we've got this W-2 out here reporting $80,000 worth of wages, but there's no tax return that matches it. So now the automated non-filer program kicks out a notice to the taxpayer that says, we've got information that says you're required to file a return. Our records show that you didn't file a return. You need to file a return, or we're going to file one for you. All right. So if the taxpayer ignores the letter or responds in some unacceptable way, the IRS does what they call a substitute for return. All right. We refer to it as an SFR in the business. And a substitute for return is created by the IRS using available information. In this case, it'd be the W-2. So they take the W-2, the $80,000 of income, they put it down on a tax return. They give you no deductions, no credits, no exemptions, no allowances, nothing. So they calculate the liability at the highest rate and they send you a bill. All right. At that point, the burden of proof is on the taxpayer to prove that they don't owe the money. The IRS doesn't have to prove that you do owe the money. And again, if the taxpayer doesn't respond properly, if the notice goes in the trash or they respond in some improper way, the IRS gets their assessment automatically. They don't have to go to court to get the assessment. Now they start start sending out the collection notices. And again, if the taxpayer doesn't respond properly or doesn't respond at all, it goes into automated collection and they start levying paychecks, bank accounts, and other assets. And they never have to darken the door of a courtroom to do it.
You paint a picture that makes the idea of the lights being off and the windows being shuttered at the IRS seem a lot more grim than the Carnival Tuesday I was hoping it would be. That being said, a lot of people going through something like that would push Congress, like you say, into finally doing something about the IRS if they don't do it in this current
something needs to be done. It needs to be done in a well thought out manner. It needs to be done systematically. You can't go in there with an axe. You need to go in there and dismantle it. No doubt about that.
Could you go in there with an axe if you
Could
knew
I
where?
go in there with an
No,
axe?
not
I
you.
would-
Again, completely hypothetical for the purposes of the NSA tape. If a DOGE employee went in there with an axe to the server room of the automated collection system, hypothetically, would that solve the problem?
I wouldn't mind shutting down automated collection for sure, because it wreaks havoc on millions of American people. The IRS issues about 3.5 million tax liens every year, and they issue roughly 1 million to 1.5 million third-party bank levies, third-party levies, wage levies, bank levies, and so on every year. This is a big problem for people, Josh.
Right.
There's no doubt about it, and it's got to be shut down, but it's got to be shut down systematically. As much as I would like to do it, you cannot shut off, you can't simply shut off the water to the federal government. They're essential functions of the federal government that have to continue. National defense, border patrol, these are just two simple examples. You got interest on the national debt that has to be paid, or the United States goes into catastrophic default. You can't have that. There needs to be a flow of revenue to the federal government. Now, does it need to be $5.5 trillion to support $6.5 trillion of spending? No, it does not, but it needs to be dismantled systematically.
All right. Well, I agree with you on that point, and I think that's all we have for this week. So thanks for watching Taxpayers, and remember, there's no such thing as a hopeless tax case, and if you think yours is the exception, call the office or visit our website to get a hold of Dan here. He can help you see the daylight. Dan, tell them where else they can follow along with your Taxpayers' Rights Crusade.
I'm on social media at Pillow Talks Taxes. Check it out. My newsletter, Pillow Talks Taxes, comes out 10 times a year. Go to my website, TaxHelpOnline.com. Buy any book off my website at any price point, and you get a free 15-minute consultation directly with me.